Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to lesson 29. In this lesson, we're going to cover verbs that have a wow or a ya as their third root letter. So these are irregular verbs, and so far we've had 3 lessons. This is the third lesson on irregular verbs. And we said that irregular verbs have a weak letter, a ya or a wow, as one of the 3 root letters. So in lesson 23, we covered irregular verbs that have a weak letter as their first letter, as their first root letter. So for example, the verb wajada. In lesson 28, the previous lesson, we looked at irregular verbs that have a weak letter as their second root letter. For example, sayara, the ya in the second letter. And in this lesson, we're going to cover irregular verbs that have a weak letter as their final root letter. And there are 3 kinds of this irregular verb. There is the first kind is verbs that follow the kataba pattern, meaning that all of the root letters have a fatha. Kataba, daraba, fataha. But the third letter is a wow. So an example of that would be the three root letters rajawa, which become the past tense verb raja. You also have the kataba pattern where the third letter is a ya. So for example, ramaya, which becomes rama. And then you have verbs that don't follow the kataba pattern. They instead follow the shariba pattern. So the second letter actually has a kasra, shariba. But the third letter, again, is a weak letter. It's a waw or a ya. And in this case, both forms look similar. And so you only have one additional table you have to memorize. And an example of this is the verb radiya. Radiya. Notice the kasra on the da. Okay, so let's get started. So we'll start with the kataba pattern where the third letter is a waw. And for our example, we'll take the verb raja, which comes from rajawa. So raja means to hope. So raja is he hoped. Rajawa is those two, they hoped. Notice how sometimes this final waw is dropped, but other times it comes back. So raja, we don't see the waw, but rajawa, it comes back. And then we can continue the table. Rajau, notice not raju, rajau, rajat, rajata, rajauna. So again, you have to pay attention which of these forms have the waw, like rajauna, which of these do not. Starting from rajauna, the waw comes back and you see it in the remaining forms. So rajauta, rajautuma, rajautum, rajauti, rajautuma, rajautunna, rajautu, rajauna. So pause the video and practice this table on your own until you've memorized it. Let's move on to present tense. Present tense, we'll start with again the same root letters. We notice that we see all of the root letters in the present tense. Yaruju. We don't say yaruju, so it's not like yansuru, but it's yaruju. We just put a sukun on the final waw in the case of the third person masculine singular. Then here, yarjuwani, yarujuna. Taruju, tarujuwani, yarujuna. Notice how these two are the same here. Yarujuna, yarujuna. Taruju, which is the same as here. Tarujuwani, tarujuna. Tarujina, tarujuwani, tarujuna. Notice again, these two are the same. Aruju, naruju. Alright, so this is the present tense table. Go ahead and pause the video and practice this on your own using rajawa or using potentially a different verb if you know it. We'll cover some examples later on. Okay, let's move on to the kataba pattern, but where the third letter is a ya instead of a waw. So as an example of that, we'll take the verb rama, which comes from ramaya. So the root letter is ramaya. The past tense verb becomes rama, which means he threw. So rama, ramaya, ramau. Notice that the ya can sometimes change to a waw. Ramat, now the ya disappeared altogether. Ramata, rameina. And from here on, you see all of including the ya, you see all of the root letters. Ramaita, rameituma, rameitum, rameiti, rameituma, rameitunna, rameitu, rameina. Alright, let's switch to present tense. Again, using the same verb, rama. The present tense here is yarmi. Yarmi. So let's go through the table. Yarmi, yarmiyani, yarmuna. Tarmi, tarmiyani, yarmina. Tarmi, tarmiyani, tarmuna. Tarmina, tarmiyani, tarmina. Again, notice that this is the same as this. Armi, narmi. So practice both of these tables, the present and the past tense, by pausing the video and just going through it on your own using the verb rama. Now we'll cover the last case where we have the shariba pattern, but the third letter is a waw or a ya. There are many such verbs in Arabic. We'll go with radiya. There's many other ones like baqiya and so on. Let's go through this. Radiya, radiya, radu. Okay, so these two, there's no difference. But here we drop the ya. So it's not radayu, it's just radu. Radiyat, radiyata, radina. Radita, radituma, raditum, raditi, radituma, raditunna, raditu, radina. Okay. All right, let's go to yarda. So we have yarda, yardayani, yardona, tarda, tardayani, yardayna, tarda, tardayani, tardona, tardayna, tardayani, tardayna. So again, notice the same two here. Arda, narda. Now here's your chance to pause the video and practice both of these tables, the past tense and the present tense of the shariba pattern verbs, but where the third letter is a waw or a ya. So here we have radiya, but the same tables hold through if the last vowel was a waw instead of a ya as well. All right, let's move on to some example irregular verbs. So you don't have to, this course isn't focused on memorizing vocabulary words, but it just helps to see a few examples of the past tense and the present tense. So we've seen raja already. Let's take a look at qada. So qada, here you have the final letter here being a ya. So we see here qada yaqdi. So this is similar to, which form have we seen before that's like this? This is similar to rama yarmi. So if we go back here, we have rama yarmi. So the same table would apply to qada yaqdi. Okay, which means to determine. Then we have masha yamshi, same form. Hada yahdi, same form. Then we have here two important verbs, baqiya, to remain, and khashya, to fear. Both of them used very commonly in the Quran. Here we have baqiya yabqa, khashya yakhsha. Both of these follow the last pattern that we saw, the radiya pattern. Okay, so the whole table will apply to both of these verbs. All right, so let's practice this by looking at some verses in the Quran where these irregular verbs appear. We'll start with أُولَٰئِكَ يَرْجُونَ رَحْمَةَ اللَّهِ. Those are the ones that hope for the mercy of God. Okay, so we see here yarujuna. This is present tense. It's third person, masculine plural. Yarujuna. They're the ones that hope for the mercy of God. Yamshuna ala al-ard. Similar pattern here. Yamshuna. They walk on the earth. La yakhshawna ahadan illallah. So this is not exactly the same pattern because yakhshawna is part of this last form here, the shariba pattern, the radiya. So we see here yarudawna, not yaruduna, yarudawna. So similarly in the Quran we have la yakhshawna ahadan illallah. They do not fear anyone except for Allah. Or translated another way, they only fear Allah. Hadaynahum ila siratim mustaqim. Hadayna is we guided them. So hadayna, we guided, hum, them. Okay, and this is, which form here is this? This is hada yahdi. So we guided them ila siratim mustaqim, to a straight path. To an upright path, perhaps you could say. So we will end here, inshallah. So this completes our study of irregular verbs that have weak letters. Okay, so jazakallahu khair. Please practice these lessons, especially lesson 24, 28, and 29, to fully master irregular verbs, because they can be a little bit tricky. But inshallah, once you study the tables and you memorize them, you'll be in good shape. Jazakallahu khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.